The words couldn't have been starker. Last year, the national security-focused outlet War on the Rocks published a piece with the opening line, "Burkina Faso is dying." Delving into the West African nation's ongoing jihadist insurgency, it hinted at pressures so great the country may soon cease to exist. This wasn't hyperbole. Just 12 months later, up to 60% of Burkina Faso is in the hands of Islamist rebels. 2 million citizens, equivalent to 10% of the population, are trapped in cities besieged by insurgents. As the death toll balloons, the overwhelmed military is forging ties with Russia to try and stem its losses. In short, Burkina Faso today is a nation in the midst of a full-blown meltdown. And yet, how many of us have heard of this crisis in the heart of Africa? When was the last time you turned on the news and you saw a report from the Burkina Faso War? Perpetually drowned out by other conflicts, the war in Burkina Faso is in danger of becoming the great forgotten tragedy of our time. Yet, as we are about to see, that doesn't mean it's not having any wider impact. From counterterrorism to geopolitics, this overlooked crisis is shaping the world in unpredictable ways. Every summer, the Norwegian Refugee Council publishes a list of the world's most neglected crises. By analysing rates of media coverage and humanitarian funding, plus diplomatic initiatives to solve the problem, the NRC is able to assign every displacement crisis on Earth a ranking. Some, like those in Gaza and Ukraine, score highly on almost every conceivable metric. Others, like the war in Sudan, consistently rank low. And then you have Burkina Faso. In both 2023 and 2024, the NRC awarded the West African nation the #1 spot on its list, meaning it got less funding and less visibility than any other crisis on Earth. This makes this the sort of war you could mention to reasonably informed people and get nothing back but a blank look. And with good reason. Media coverage has been close to non-existent. There are good reasons for this. Over the past few months, the military junta that runs the country has banned multiple international outlets, including heavy hitters like the BBC. Meanwhile, local journalists have been scared off writing about the crisis due to heavy punishments for anyone critical of the army's leadership. Last fall, for example, the government forcibly conscripted 2 journalists, one of whom was in his 60s, to go and fight on the front lines. Still, for all the barriers to doing journalism in Burkina Faso, the extent of the global media's collective shrug is something to behold. Data provided to The Economist by analytics firm Chartbeat shows that every month, some 100,000 stories are published globally on the Ukraine and Gaza wars. The NRC, by contrast, has called coverage of the Burkina Faso war negligible. Obviously, there are plenty of other wars out there that are suffering from the conflicts in the Middle East and Europe sucking up all the oxygen. Both Sudan and Myanmar, to choose just 2 examples, are criminally overlooked. Even so, Burkina Faso may be a special case, a war so neglected as to be all but invisible. Maybe it's in part due to the nation's reputation for chaos. In 2022 alone, the country suffered 2 military coups, the latter bringing to power current leader Ibrahim Traoré. It could also be due to the neighborhood Burkina Faso lies in. Part of the Sahel, the strip of land where the burning heat of the Sahara gives way to the plains of the African savanna, Burkina Faso has the misfortune to sit slap bang in the middle of a region-wide insurgency. Its immediate neighbors, Mali and Niger, are roiled by battles with jihadists, while further east Nigeria and Chad likewise struggle to contain armed groups. But even in this dangerous corner of the world, Burkina Faso should stand out. The Economist claims that more than 2/3 of deaths in the central Sahel due to jihadism take place within its borders. This year, the Global Terrorism Index labeled it the country with the highest impact from terrorism anywhere on Earth. At the heart of this lie 2 violent groups, the Al-Qaeda-affiliated JNIM coalition and the local ISIS branch, Islamic State Sahel Province, better known as IS Sahel. If you want to go deeper, the Africa Center carries a pretty good list of all the subgroups that make up these 2 bodies, but the simple version is that both are radical, both are powerful, and both are extremely dangerous. Just as we were working on this piece, for example, news broke of a JNIM attack on an army outpost that killed over 100 Burkina Faso soldiers. Overall, the 2 insurgent groups combined are thought to have placed around 60% of Burkina Faso outside of governmental control. But while that's been a disaster for the military junta in Ouagadougou, it's been even worse for the civilians caught up in it. With the state in full retreat from swaths of land, millions are now facing some of the worst wartime conditions of anywhere on Earth. If you're looking for an easy shorthand to demonstrate the dire straits Burkina Faso is in, you'd be hard-pressed to find anything that could beat the blockaded towns. Scattered across the country, the 39 towns and cities are home to a combined 2 million people, nearly 10% of the population. Surrounded by armed fighters, each is under a movement ban imposed by the jihadists as retribution for government attempts to recruit civilian fighters. Because the insurgents lack heavy weaponry, these aren't traditional sieges in which buildings inside the noose are heavily shelled. Instead, citizens are merely trapped inside, unable to leave. But that word, merely, hides a whole universe of suffering. As a poor nation, Burkina Faso already had over 4 in 10 of its citizens living below the poverty line. These blockades are now ensuring that this poverty spreads ever more widely. The New Humanitarian reports that food is scarce inside these towns and that water systems are failing to properly work. Local healthcare is on the verge of collapse. The NRC interviewed a woman living in the commune of Kongosi who described how her family had been reduced to eating leaves. Across the country as a whole, the stats are dire. Al Jazeera claims that 400 health facilities have been shut down, with another 400 barely able to function, leaving 3.6 million without access to healthcare. Likewise, some 1,600 schools have been forced to shutter, depriving children of education. Speaking of kids, it's thought that about 60% of the country's 2 million internally displaced people are children. Many are stuck in camps that lack even basic services. To add insult to injury, some of these camps are themselves under blockade. And then there are the deaths. Like any armed conflict, the fighting in Burkina Faso has led to a sharp spike in violent deaths. Back in 2022, as things were starting to slide toward chaos, there were 3,627 recorded fatalities, about as many as died in the 3 decades of the Northern Irish Troubles. Last year, that number rose to 8,400, a 137% increase. This year looks on track to be just as bad. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, recorded over 900 violent deaths in May 2024 alone. All this needs to be placed in the context of the violence happening elsewhere in the Sahel. In the decade from 2013 to 2023, ACLED records that at least 42,000 people were killed in jihadist-related violence across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. 3.3 million were forced to flee their homes. It wasn't meant to be this way. Back in 2007, a mere 1% of all global deaths related to Islamist terror took place in the Sahel. By 2022, though, it had risen to 43%. And all of that begs the question, what happened? In the Burkina case, the answer could be simplified down to award-winning bad luck. Back in 2014, a grassroots uprising overthrew longtime dictator Blaise Compaoré and began a short-lived experiment with democracy. Unfortunately, this shock to the system coincided with a growing insurgency in neighboring Mali. As early as 2015, jihadists began staging attacks across the border. But it would be concerted recruitment efforts by these armed groups in Burkina Faso's poorest, remotest regions that would really set things ablaze. There, the jihadists found disenfranchised, forgotten people who could be seduced by their poison message. Here's how War on the Rocks explained it, quoting, "Long-standing economic, ethnic, political and social divisions in the country's underdeveloped periphery proved ideal kindling for jihadist insurrections. The result was a slow-burning fire, one that initially took the form of a homegrown insurgency near the Malian border, but which soon swept across nearly every single region. Crisis Group reports that of Burkina Faso's 13 provinces, jihadists are now active in 11 of them. This spread fueled yet more political chaos. In January 2022, the military overthrew the government, only for the new junta to in turn be overthrown by Captain Ibrahim Traoré. In both cases, the soldiers argued that they were stepping in to save their nation from a weak government unable to contain the violence. In the wake of both coups, though, the violence only got worse. It used to be that local commanders were given leeway to cut regional peace deals with the jihadists. When the juntas forbade that practice, the death toll skyrocketed. The final lump of kindling was dropped on this national dumpster fire in 2023 when Captain Traoré abruptly announced the end of Operation Sabre. Established in 2009 to help fight regional terrorism, Operation Sabre was a contingent of 600 French special forces operating on Burkina soil. If you've heard of them, it's likely in the context of the 2017 Niger ambush on American Green Berets. It was Sabre that came to their rescue. In 2023, though, Sabre was expelled from Burkina Faso, part of a wider tilt in the Sahel away from the former colonial power of France and towards Russia. When the French departed, they took their expertise with them. You won't be surprised to hear that violence quickly rose. However, we don't want to give the impression that jihadists are the only violent actors in Burkina Faso's forgotten war. While they are the most brutal by far, there are other actors contributing to the ever-growing civilian death toll, not least among them the Burkina military itself. The thing about fighting an insurgency is that fighters will always have the option of blending in with the civilian population. America and its allies faced this in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and it's always a nightmare for security services. How do you balance your need to root out terrorists with your need to protect civilians? Even with the best intentions, it's not an easy task. And good intentions seem pretty far down the list of priorities of Burkina Faso's military. The world got a nasty taste of this in April of this year. Human Rights Watch has documented how the army implemented collective punishment for the villagers of Nodin and Soro, where the NGO alleges that they mass executed a combined 223 civilians, including 56 children. Although shocking, this was just the latest in a series of military-led atrocities against the civilian population. A year earlier, the army killed 106 villagers in a place known as Karma. Voice of America reports that today, quote, mass killings of villagers have become common in northern Burkina Faso. To be clear, the army is not alone in this. As the New York Times notes, quoting here, Islamist militants have killed more civilians in Burkina Faso than the military or militias have by far. Still, the scale of government-sanctioned killings is both eye-watering and constantly growing. According to the ACLED, the number of civilians executed by soldiers rose from 430 in 2022 to 735 in 2023, an increase of 70%. This May alone, the project records 270 such killings. In their words, this contributed to the military forces being the deadliest perpetrator of violence toward civilians in May 2024. An additional complicating factor is that many of these killings are done seemingly based on ethnicity, with the targets most frequently coming from the Fulani minority. A group of 30 million who live across West Africa, the Fulani are almost all Muslims. In Burkina Faso and other states, they're broadly marginalized, mistrusted, and feared for their supposed susceptibility to jihadist recruitment. Because of these fears, they're often treated by the military as collaborators. Foreign Policy reports on the extent of this lethal discrimination, quoting, more than half of the civilians killed by the military or ethnic militias in Burkina Faso and Mali last year were Fulani, despite the fact that they make up around 10 and 14% of each country, respectively. That massacre in Karma that claimed the lives of 156 villagers, nearly all of them are thought to have come from the Fulani minority. Such killings are the equivalent of merrily chucking gasoline over a raging wildfire. As the military executes innocent Fulanis for suspected ties to the jihadists, more and more Fulanis start to feel like the only way to protect their families is to pick up a gun and join the insurgency. Or as War on the Rocks puts it, quoting again, it has been well documented that the security services' abuses have fueled radicalization. There are other ways, too, that the military junta is actively working to make the country worse. One of them, we mentioned earlier. Under a new mobilization law, the army is increasingly arresting its opponents, sticking them in uniform, and then sending them to fight and die on the front lines. Another is by dismantling any remaining element of democratic accountability. After pledging to hold elections by July this year following the 2022 coup, the junta has recently declared that it will remain in power for another 5 years. Few seriously expect it to willingly step down after that. Yet arguably, the most destabilizing, most dangerous element of the current conflict isn't the military itself, but something they inspired. And now it's time for us to dig into the controversial militias known as the Homeland Defense Volunteers. In the last days of President Compaore's rule, growing insecurity in the Burkina hinterland led local civilians to form self-defense groups. Known in the local language as Cogluego, which Crisis Group translates as Guardians of the Bush, their goal was to fight the bandits cropping up in multiple regions. However, as the insurgency in Mali began to spill across Burkina Faso's borders, the Cogluego found themselves fighting not bandits, but jihadists. It's likely this track record that the democratically elected government had in mind in January 2020 when it incorporated self-defense groups into an official paramilitary structure. Known as the Homeland Defense Volunteers, or VDPs, after their French name, Volontaires pour la Défense de la Patrie, the force was initially intended to bolster the understaffed army. With just 12,000 people on their rolls, including the gendarmerie, the Burkina security services were judged too small to effectively fight multiple jihadist groups. Yet it wouldn't be until after Captain Traore's coup of September 2022 that the VDPs would grow into significant players. Announcing his plans for total war against the insurgents, Traoré called for 50,000 new recruits to join the VDPs. The result was the VDPs becoming what the ACLED project has called the fourth most active armed actor in Burkina Faso after JNIM, the military, and IS Sahel. Today, they can be found in almost every province. From a sympathetic perspective, this might seem like a reasonable response to the insurgency. After all, armies regularly call up ordinary people to fight. Just look at Ukraine, where both Kiev and Moscow have mobilized parts of their populations. In the Burkina Faso context, though, the creation and empowerment of the VDPs seems to be only making things worse. Because they receive little training, volunteers tend to die on the front lines at a higher rate than ordinary soldiers. Worse, some of them have been implicated in horrific war crimes. Like the military, the VDPs are known for targeting Fulani villages. In a long-form report, Crisis Group explains how, quoting here, their actions paradoxically contribute to escalating violence through the alleged crimes that some of them commit against civilians, sparking retaliatory cycles among armed factions. Unlike the military, though, the VDPs don't just target civilians they suspect of sympathizing with the jihadists. In the same report, the non-profit describes how some VDP leaders misuse their authority to settle scores with their neighbors or to simply drive people off land that they want for themselves. Because the government wants to be seen as tough, it does almost nothing to rein in the worst excesses. As the Council on Foreign Relations notes, a situation in which every citizen is a potential extremist gives members of the armed forces the pretext to attack innocent civilians in the name of going after extremists. We can see this just by monitoring how the violence in the countryside is increasing as more and more VDPs are deployed in rural areas. The ACLED project puts it bluntly. The resort to arming civilians in the Burkina context has led to serious human rights violations and an escalation of violence. Worryingly, some of this violence has taken place far from its original epicenter, where the borders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger meet. As the VDPs have spread into Kolapalogo province, for example, their local conflict with JNIM jihadists has resulted in what the project characterized as extreme violence on the border with neighboring Togo. And it's here that we get to what may be the most worrying part of the entire Burkina Faso conflict, its ability to spill over into nearby states. As the wider Sahel region has lurched into crisis, West Africa's coastal states have remained mostly untouched. Yet that may be about to change. With Burkina Faso directly bordering Benin, Togo, Ghana, and Côte d'Ivoire, there are growing fears that the violence could soon sweep over multiple American allies. In the years before Burkina Faso went completely to hell, the clearest sign that things were going downhill is the way jihadist groups crossing from Mali were able to both recruit locally and launch spectacular attacks on Burkinabe soil. Well, something similar now seems to be happening to West Africa's coastal states. Already, jihadists based in Burkina Faso have launched attacks in Togo and Benin before retreating back across the border. As the Burkinabe conflict increases in intensity, there are fears that Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire could become targets too. In fact, there are some who think the jihadists have already established footholds in these nations' border regions. Foreign Policy wrote back in May that the only reason Ghana hasn't yet been targeted is because, quote, insurgents see their access to the country as a safe haven and smuggling route as too useful to destabilize with direct attacks. Now, we should point out here that a lot of counterterrorism experts get annoyed when pundits start talking about domino effects, so we're not going to try and claim that wealthier, more populated Ghana is in danger of becoming the next Burkina Faso. However, there's a whole universe of experiences between becoming the next Burkina Faso and just carrying on as normal. And in between may lie Ghana's worst-case scenario, a sharp uptick in jihadist activity that kills civilians, drains resources, and badly destabilizes national politics. From an international perspective, what happens in states like Ghana matters for counterterrorism efforts. Since the junta in Niger expelled US forces, Washington has been making Ghana one of its new focal points from where it fights jihadist networks. Earlier this summer, US Africa Command oversaw the flintlock counterterrorism exercises in Ghana to help fortify it against Islamic violence. Should Ghana itself become the site of a jihadist insurgency in its north, it will further imperil Pentagon efforts to stop the spread of violent extremism. Something of a major worry, since a lot of those extremist groups use pockets of lawlessness to plot attacks against the US and Europe. And then there are the geopolitical considerations that the Burkina War has unleashed. Perhaps the most major one of all, the steady encroachment of Russia and former Wagner Group forces into the Sahel. For a long time, Burkina Faso was considered a security partner of the West, albeit one that never received as much funding as it really needed. that all changed following the coups of 2022. Rather than fund Captain Traore's junta, most of Ouagadougou's backers cut the nation off. While this may have been all they could realistically do, it opened the door for Traore's pivot to Russia. Following the lead of the military junta in Mali, the captain responded to the West's efforts by throwing his lot in with Moscow. On a recent visit to Ouagadougou, Al Jazeera reported that the capital's walls are adorned with pro-Russian graffiti and Russian flags fly in the streets. Since November, Russian soldiers have been present in the nation, and this June, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov traveled to Burkina Faso to declare Moscow would supply the junta with additional weaponry. Although the stated aim is to help fight the insurgents, such Russian largesse is unlikely to make much of a difference. The Foreign Policy Research Institute reports that Wagner's arrival in Mali allowed the regime to retake important territory, such as the strategic town of Kidal, but only at the cost of a major increase in civilian deaths and an upsurge of violence. No, what really matters to the Kremlin likely isn't subduing a jihadist insurgency in faraway Burkina Faso, but making sure another country in the so-called global south is sympathetic to Moscow. Indeed, multiple Sahel states are now courting Vladimir Putin's regime. Niger has joined Mali and Burkina Faso in calling in the Russians, while Chad's leader is absurdly trying to be allies with both Paris and Moscow. In Sudan's civil war, the rebranded remnants of Wagner initially backed the Rapid Support Forces, although Putin now seems to be pivoting to the opposing Sudanese armed forces. As for the Central African Republic, Wagner has been there so long that there's a statue to them in the capital of Bangui. The result of all this is the slow but steady building of a band of Russian sympathizers across West and Central Africa. Sympathizers that the Kremlin clearly hopes will side with it and China against America and Europe in any new Cold War. Yet for all the tragedy of Burkina Faso might represent a headache for the wider world, we shouldn't forget the people who are suffering the most, the 22 million citizens of this beleaguered nation. For many in Burkina Faso, the last few years have been a non-stop nightmare, one in which more and more of their country collapses into violence while the rest of the world does nothing but give a collective shrug. Now look, we're all only human. There's only so much time in the world and so many other crises to worry about. You absolutely shouldn't feel guilty if you've never heard of this one faraway war before. Yet we can't help but feel that it's strange that no one is talking about it, that the media coverage of Burkina Faso's sad collapse is even more lacking than coverage of the wars in Sudan and Myanmar. Look, we may be just one small YouTube channel, but we hope we've at least now done our part to raise a bit of awareness of this catastrophe, because for millions of people, this isn't just a 25-minute video, it's their lives. It's a war that's devastating their homelands. At the very least, the rest of the world should try and be aware of their suffering.